This is an erotic novella. I fondly call them smutellas. They are brief, intense explorations of forbidden desire in extraordinary circumstances. Like a stolen moment between the characters themselves, this story prioritizes passion and connection over extensive world building or deep thematic exploration. Expect vivid emotion, explicit intimacy, and the raw heat of enemies discovering they're meant to be lovers under absolutely questionable circumstances. This is escapist fantasy designed to sweep you into their world just long enough to experience the electricity between them. For readers seeking a quick, steamy supernatural romance with dark themes, welcome. For those wanting extensive character development or detailed exploration of the complex issues touched upon, this may feel like an appetizer rather than a full meal, and that's entirely by design. Content warnings apply. Enjoy the ride. Top tropes: divinity/worship, kink. Forced proximity. Enemies to obsession. Trapped in a gothic manner. Creator falls for their creation. Top content warnings: dubious consent. Public humiliation. Power imbalance. And subversion. Plus. Smut starts in Chapter 4. Trust I'm always torn between the readers that want more plot/world building, and those that just want to get to business. Chapter 1. Silas. The sculpture stood unveiled beneath harsh gallery lights, its marble surface cold and luminous. Silas Blackwell remained in the shadows at the edge of the room, his shoulder blades pressed against the wall, watching as the small crowd of collectors and critics circled his latest work. He could hear their whispered conversations, half admiration, half scandal, and his chest tightened with each murmur. "Magnificent," breathed an elderly woman in pearls, her fingers hovering just inches from the sculpture's carved cheekbone. "But is it safe to display such a thing?" Her companion, a thin man with silver hair, shook his head gravely. "Blackwell's work always teeters on the edge of propriety. This one," he gestured at the figure, "this one leaps right over it." Silas's fingers found the familiar motion, working stone dust from beneath his nails, a nervous habit that offered no relief. The figure before him was the most ambitious thing he had ever coaxed from marble, and it already looked nothing like a man. The Fae was caught in a languid recline, one arm draped across its torso, the other extended upward, but the proportions were wrong in a way that made the eye linger. The forearm was a shade too long, the fingers tapered into delicate points that might have been claws, and the shoulder blades swelled into ridges hinting at something folded and hidden under skin. Along the spine, Silas had etched the suggestion of translucent membranes, as if wings lay pressed beneath flesh, and the marble eyes were carved without pupils, catching the light like faceted gems. Veins of iridescence ribboned through the stone of its torso, and his chisel had raised faint whorls across the ribs that looked almost like the patterning of butterfly wings. The result was a blend of beauty and unease, a body that invited admiration, while reminding any human viewer that it belonged to a being made of entirely different rules. Every curve spoke of otherness, of breath held between exhale and gasp, carved with such intimate detail that it seemed impossible the artist hadn't traced those contours with his own hands. Which, of course, was impossible. No human had access to the Fae. Artists who dared attempt Fae subjects worked from second-hand descriptions or stolen glimpses, and even then, they risked offense. The Fae were notoriously vain, prone to terrible retribution if their likeness was captured incorrectly, or sometimes, if it was captured too perfectly. "Do you think they're truly this beautiful?" murmured another voice. "Or has Blackwell simply made them what he wishes them to be?" "Perhaps that's what makes it so compelling," came the response. "The desire of it." Silas tugged at his sleeves, conscious of the unfamiliar weight and cut of the jacket he'd been talked into wearing. He preferred the freedom of an apron and bare forearms. The tailored fabric felt like someone else's skin. His dark hair had slipped from its tie and fallen across his face, a curtain he welcomed. At 28, he should have reveled in the prestige his taboo sculptures had earned him. but standing here under the scrutiny of strangers, he felt as if he'd been chiseled open. The figure behind him had exposed hungers he'd never intended to confess, and the fabric on his back did nothing to protect him from that gaze. The truth was, he didn't know where the knowledge came from. When he worked, his hands moved of their own accord, following grooves and ridges that felt like they existed before his chisel met stone. He would lose hours, sometimes entire nights, emerging from his studio with new details carved, the hollow behind a collarbone, the vulnerable inside of a wrist, that he had no memory of creating. It should have frightened him. It did frighten him. But fear tasted like hunger, and hunger kept him carving. "Silas!" He startled as Margaret Crane, the gallery owner, appeared at his elbow. She was a small woman with kind eyes who had taken a chance on his work when no one else would, who had displayed his first face sculpture despite 3 collectors threatening to pull their commissions. "You're hiding again," she chided gently. "This is your moment. The piece is extraordinary. Everyone's talking about it." "That's what I'm afraid of," Silas murmured, his voice barely audible above the gallery's ambient noise. Margaret studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who had managed artists for decades. "You know, there are rumors tonight. Whispers that we have unusual visitors." Silas's head snapped up. "What kind of visitors?" Before Margaret could answer, a hush fell over the gallery. Not the polite quiet of cultivated attention, but something primal, the silence of prey animals sensing a predator. Conversations died mid-word. Wineglasses froze halfway to lips. Every head turned, first subtly, then all at once, toward the entrance. Silas turned with them, drawn by the same gravitational shift. The figure in the doorway was tall, masked, and motionless, but the space around him warped like heat shimmer over summer pavement. The mask was forged of blackened silver and etched with patterns that moved, that shimmered like oil on water, like symbols that refused to be read. Beneath it, the lower half of the stranger's face was visible, a mouth curved in a faint, unreadable smile. "Is that?" Silas began, his heart a sudden drum against his ribs. "I don't know," Margaret whispered, her breath catching. "But look how everyone's watching him. And look how he regards your sculpture." The stranger moved. That was the only word for it. Moved, because it couldn't be called walking. The crowd reacted instinctively, parting in ripples, bodies turning sideways as if they couldn't bear to face him directly, but also couldn't bear to look away. His walk was fluid, seamless, each limb flowing into the next without the small hesitations and adjustments that made a body human. His arms didn't swing. His shoulders didn't shift. He glided across the floor as if friction were a courtesy he'd declined. And his shadow? Silas watched it lag half a beat behind, watched it keep moving when the stranger paused in front of the sculpture, watched it snap back into place like something on a leash. Silas couldn't stop staring. The man stood before his sculpture as if encountering an old lover. In the flickering gallery light, the stranger's eyes behind the mask glowed with their own luminescence, backlit from within. "His shadow," Silas said softly, mostly to himself. "Did you see it? It doesn't—" "Don't point it out," Margaret interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp, suddenly afraid. "Don't look at it too long, or he'll know you noticed." But Silas kept looking. The stranger's lips moved as if whispering to the sculpture. No sound carried, but Silas felt it in his sternum, a resonance that hummed through bone. The light behind the figure shimmered, and for a breath span, the stranger's exposed skin looked poreless, impossibly smooth. Darkness stretched taut over something that had never been flesh. Then the stranger turned, slowly, and looked directly at Silas. The gaze pierced him. Silas felt it enter him below the ribs, felt it pluck something deep in his chest cavity like a finger testing a harp string to see if it would hold tension or snap. The stranger inclined his head a fraction. Acknowledgement. Or invitation. Silas looked away, throat dry, face burning. A flush crept up his neck because it wasn't just that the man was clearly inhuman. It was that Silas wanted him. Wanted to sculpt him. Trace him, Map him in marble. Even though every nerve ending in his body screamed, "This is not safe. This will devour you." "How long has he been standing there?" Silas asked, his voice cracking, feeling as if time had stopped. "Not even 2 minutes," Margaret murmured, reverent and wary in equal measure. "But look how he's changed the room." She was right. The atmosphere had shifted. The gallery's energy no longer buzzing with curated anticipation, but hovering at the edge of religious awe. Or terror. Perhaps both. "Maybe he's thinking of buying it," Silas offered weakly. "Maybe," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. The words landed heavy, ominous in Silas's chest, like a stone dropped into a well too deep to hear it strike bottom. The stranger wasn't observing the sculpture the way a collector assessed an acquisition. He was communing with it. Around them, the gallery's rhythm tried to resume. Glasses clinked. Conversations stuttered back to life. Red dots appeared beneath smaller, safer works, little sold stickers that meant money and recognition, and all the things Silas had supposedly come here for. But he couldn't look away from the masked figure. Time blurred. Silas didn't know how long he stood there, shoulder blades aching against the wall, breath shallow, before he blinked, and the stranger was simply gone, vanished between one heartbeat and the next, leaving the gallery feeling hollow, emptied of something vital. Silas's body sagged. Relief, yes, but also a disappointment so sharp he could taste it. Later, when the gallery had emptied to a handful of lingering patrons and the lights were turned down, Silas realized he was standing alone in front of his piece. Without the bustle and noise, the fae he'd carved seemed different. In the softened shadows, its pose read less like repose and more like coiled potential. The planes of its face, which had looked serene under bright lights, now hinted at something watchful. He lifted his hand, mirroring the woman in pearls, and hovered his fingers over the marble cheek. It was, of course, cool stone. Yet the line of the jaw and the tilt of the brow tugged at him in a way he hadn't anticipated, as if the expression contained a question he couldn't quite answer. When had he decided on that blade-sharp sweep of stone? Had the eyes always caught the light as if they were following someone? He remembered the hours spent carving them by lamplight, trying to capture an otherworldly gaze, and now, in the quiet, he saw how much longing he'd poured into it himself. Beneath the veneer of grace, the fae's mouth curved with patient hunger, a hunger that might be his own. "Remarkable," said a voice behind him. Silas spun. The masked man was there, a half step too close, as if he'd slipped into the space between one breath and the next. He hadn't made a sound, no creaking floorboard, no rustle of clothing, and the suddenness of his appearance prickled the back of Silas's neck. Up close he was taller than Silas had realized, lean and elegant in a way that drew the eye. The mask he wore was a delicate lattice of metal and stone. Its patterns caught the low light. Beneath it, the only visible skin was his mouth, and the smile it formed was flawless and empty at once. It curled at the edges the way a smile should, but there was no warmth behind it, no sense of shared reaction. Only the feeling of being evaluated like another piece of art. Silas's mouth dried. He had nothing. "You capture something most artists miss," the stranger said. His voice was velvet over gravel, smooth but layered. 2 tones vibrating in harmony. One pitched for ears and one pitched for somewhere deeper. Somewhere in the chest cavity. The hunger. The longing. Most depictions of the fae focus on their beauty, but you. He gestured toward the sculpture. "You understand that desire and danger aren't opposites." Silas's breath caught. His pulse roared in his ears. "I don't know what you mean," he said, though it was a lie, and they both knew it. The stranger's smile sharpened. "Don't you?" Silence bloomed between them. The rest of the gallery had emptied. Silas was sure of it now. Or maybe the world had. Margaret was gone, purposefully absent. It was just Silas, the stranger, and the sculpture watching them both with stone eyes that somehow felt more alive than Silas's own. "Tell me," the man said, beginning to circle the marble form with slow, predatory grace. Where did you study? Who taught you? I'm self-taught, Silas whispered. I see things in the stone. I follow what's already there. Interesting. The stranger stopped across from him, and even through the mask, Silas felt the intensity of his gaze. And what do you see when you look at this piece now? Silas hesitated. But the words came anyway, rising from that place in him that guided his hands when he carved. That place that knew things he shouldn't. Loneliness, he said. Power that understands its own capacity for ruin. Something that was bound but won't stay contained forever. The stranger went very, very still. Contained? He repeated, tasting the word like wine. Like it's waiting, Silas said, unable to stop himself now, his gaze fixed on the sculpture. Like it knows exactly when its time will come. Much like you, my work will linger long after I am gone. The stranger tilted his head, bird-like, listening to something Silas couldn't hear. Then he smiled again, and this time there was something in it that made Silas's spine prickle with warning. You see very clearly, Silas Blackwell. The sound of his name, his full name, spoken aloud in that doubled voice hit like a blow. Silas flinched. I am honored. I make it my business to know exceptional artists. The stranger moved again, circling Silas now instead of the sculpture. Especially those brave enough to court danger with their work. I don't court danger, Silas said, though the protest sounded absurd even to him. No? The subharmonic in the stranger's voice rose, resonating in Silas's ribcage. Then what would you call creating art that could offend beings capable of exquisite retribution? Silas opened his mouth, closed it. I have to create what I see, he said finally. I can't help it. Compulsion, the stranger mused. A rare kind. He stepped closer, close enough that Silas could smell him now. Not cologne, not any human scent. He smelled like ozone after lightning, like stone dust and cedar sap, like blood and the inside of a thunderstorm. A scent that made Silas's knees weaken and his jaw ache with want. Your work shows promise, the man said, his voice dropping to near whisper. But I suspect you're capable of much more. Given the right inspiration. Heat coiled in Silas's gut, pooled low in his belly. What kind of inspiration? He asked, barely breathing. The stranger's smile was slow, full of dark promises. The kind that comes from seeing your subject as it truly is. No masks, no glamour. Just truth, flesh, and hunger. Then, with no warning, he stepped back, breaking whatever spell had wound around them. The air between them cooled, and Silas could breathe again, gasping like he'd been underwater. I know where you work, Silas Blackwell, the stranger said, already fading toward the shadows near the gallery's entrance. Perhaps I'll visit soon. We have much to discuss. And then he was gone. As if he'd never been there at all. Silas stood alone beside his sculpture, heart hammering, lungs burning, the scent of ozone and stone dust still clinging to the air around him. He touched the marble, needing to ground himself, and realized his hands were shaking. The taxi ride back to his studio passed in a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. Silas sat in the back seat, replaying every word, every glance, every moment of that encounter. The stranger had known exactly what to say to burrow under his skin like a splinter. I know where you work. The words should have been threatening. Instead, they'd sent a thrill through him that he didn't want to examine, a dark anticipation that tasted like hunger and fear in equal measure. His studio was a converted warehouse in one of the city's less fashionable districts, all exposed brick and industrial lighting, high ceilings, and drafty corners. It was here, surrounded by half-finished sculptures and blocks of raw stone, by tarps covered in marble dust and tools that left calluses on his palms, that Silas felt most like himself. The space smelled of cut stone and damp brick, turpentine and cold metal. But tonight, the familiar sanctuary felt different. Restless. The air itself seemed to wait, held breath before thunder. Silas poured himself wine, a cheap watered-down red, and stood before his latest work in progress. Another fey figure, barely begun. The rough outline suggested a feminine form caught mid-dance or mid-flight, but the details were still locked inside the marble, waiting for his hands to find them. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. "I know where you work. Perhaps I'll visit soon." Silas set down his wine and glanced toward the large windows facing the street. Full dark outside now, the city beyond reduced to distant lights. Anyone could be out there in those shadows, watching him work, cataloging his movements. The thought should have made him uncomfortable. Instead, heat prickled across his skin with anticipation as sharp as arousal. He looked at his sculpture again, at the barely emerged face that already promised otherworldly beauty. In the shifting light, its marble eyes seemed to watch him with knowing amusement, as if it understood the want building under his ribs. Tomorrow, he would continue his work. Perhaps then he would have answers to the questions that had driven him to carve obsessively for years, that had made him risk offense to capture something he barely understood. Tonight he would wait, and dream of violet eyes and promises of inspiration beyond anything he could imagine. Chapter 2. Silas. The knock came just after sunset the next evening. 3 sharp raps echoing through the exposed brick walls of Silas's studio. He froze, fingers still curled around his chisel. He wasn't expecting anyone. No delivery. No friends. He didn't really have those. No clients brave enough to visit after dark, when the city's edges grew soft and strange. But something in him had been waiting. Silas wiped stone dust from his palms. It clung to the creases, permanent as ink, heart ticking too fast, and moved toward the door. He opened it, and there he was. The stranger from the gallery stood beneath the flickering streetlight, unmasked now, and the full impact of his face hit Silas all at once. Too perfect with skin like shadow poured over glass. His eyes burned ultraviolet, luminous in the dark, backlit from within. His hair was slicked back with unnatural precision, black as fresh ink. And behind him, the shadows cast by his body fanned outward wrong. Too many of them, layered like folded wings. "Silas Blackwell," he said. "You came," Silas said, hating how his voice trembled, how exposed he felt standing in his own doorway. I wasn't sure you were real." A slow smile curved the stranger's mouth, revealing teeth, sharp white teeth. "That is often the way of our kind." Silas stepped back, wordless, throat tight, and the stranger passed through the doorway without waiting to be invited. The moment he crossed the threshold, the studio changed. Temperature dropped. Shadows lengthened and deepened into pockets of true dark. The air thickened with the scent of wet stone and violet blooms, cedar sap and something mineral that tasted like lightning on Silas's tongue. "You live inside your work," the man observed, his gaze sweeping over half-finished sculptures and plaster fragments, over tools hung on the walls and marble dust coating every surface. "That's rare. Most artists keep their art separate from their lives." Silas shut the door, pulse still hammering in his throat. "I don't really like being anywhere else." The stranger moved deeper into the space with that same impossible silence. He was simply there and then elsewhere, like frames missing from a film. "You've already begun another piece," he said, running 2 long fingers down the marble Silas had been working on. "I don't even know what I'm making," Silas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw it in a dream." "It wasn't a dream," the stranger said, turning to face him fully. "If you saw it, you could describe it to me, but you can't, can you? Not until it's done. It's a call and you answer." His face was impossible to look at straight on. Silas's brain kept trying to flatten it into something recognizable, something that made sense, but couldn't quite manage it. The angle shifted when Silas wasn't looking directly at them. "Who are you?" Silas asked. The stranger smiled. This time, it showed his teeth. All of them. Too many. Lord Valian Dustshade, he said, inclining his head like a prince acknowledging a subject, like royalty among ruins. Of the Shadow Court, and I've come to offer you a commission. Silas's breath caught in his chest. I want you to carve a god, Valian said, voice dropping to something intimate. One who has been forgotten. Suppressed. Bound beneath centuries of careful lies and erasure. I want you to give him form again. In obsidian. I don't understand, Silas whispered. Why me? Because the stone listens to you. Valian stepped closer, every inch of him vibrating with restrained power, with hunger barely leashed. Because you already dream of him. You're already halfway devoured by what you think is inspiration. Silas backed up until his hips hit the work table, heart thudding against his ribs. You're afraid? Valian asked, curious now, head tilted like a bird studying prey. I am, Silas said honestly, but not enough to say no. That pleased him. Silas could see it in the way his smile deepened, in the way those spiral eyes brightened. Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. But want. He reached out, fingers grazing Silas's cheek, a cool touch that burned like ice. Want is holy. Valian lingered at the edge of the work table. The silence stretched between them, charged as a live wire. You said he was forgotten, Silas said finally, needing to break the tension before it snapped him. Who is he? What did he do that made the Fae erase him? Valian's violet eyes caught the lamplight, reflecting it back like glittering stars. Nitharos, he said. The name struck the room like a bell, resonating in Silas's chest cavity, in his teeth, in the hollow spaces between his ribs. He wasn't a king or a warlord. Not a shining hero or tragic martyr. He was older than those categories. A god born before the courts divided themselves into light and shadow, before the Fae learned to lie about what they wanted. He walked at the edges of all things. Desire, chaos, ruin. The kind of god who made you look at yourself and see what you truly wanted, not what you've been taught to want. That sounds... Silas searched for the word. Dangerous. It was, Valian said. And it was true. But the courts didn't like truth. So they buried him. Not just his body, but the memory of him. Rewrote his name into warnings children whispered. Turned his image into sin. They broke the mirror and taught us to fear the shards. He turned towards Silas, expression unreadable behind the mask of his perfect face. I wasn't alive then. But the story's still carved into the bones of our oldest magic. Still written in blood we pretend doesn't exist. You say it like you believe it, Silas said. I believe in what was lost, Valian replied. And what we could become again if we had the courage to remember. Silas hesitated, fear and fascination warring in his chest. You want him back? To do what? Tear it all down? Destroy what the courts have built? No, Valian said, soft as silk stretched over a blade's edge. I want to give him form. What he does with it. That's not mine to dictate. You're not afraid? Silas returned the question. Valian's smile was the kind that made promises and broke oaths in the same breath, that offered everything and guaranteed nothing. Of course I'm afraid, but I'd rather risk being devoured by something real than keep feasting on beautiful lies. The air in the studio felt electric, charged like the moment before lightning struck. Silas felt dizzy, untethered, as if speaking too loudly might wake something ancient behind his own eyes, something that had been sleeping there all along. This isn't just a commission, is it? He asked, though he already knew the answer. No, Valian said, stepping closer with predatory grace. It's a resurrection. And I need you, Silas Blackwell. Not just your skill, but your instinct. Your obsession. You see truths others won't even glance at. You shape them in stone. You invite them into the world. I need you to invite him. Silas's breath came shallow, rapid. His hands trembled at his sides. Can you do it? Valian asked, voice dipping low, intimate as a lover's whisper. Can you shape something so forbidden it was stricken from memory? Silas didn't trust his voice. Instead, he nodded. Velian smiled, triumphant and reverent in equal measure. Good, he said. Then pack what you need. My car will arrive within the hour. Silas blinked, reality tilting as the words caught up with him. Pack? You'll be staying at Thornwick Manor. The sculpture cannot be made here. Velian's gaze swept across the studio with vague disapproval, dismissing Silas's entire life with a glance. Too many distractions, too many eyes, too many chances for interference. How long will it take? As long as it takes, Velian said, turning toward the door with fluid grace. Art cannot be rushed. Especially not art that matters. He paused at the threshold, his body haloed by shadow and dying streetlight. Bring warm clothes. The manor is close to the borderlands, where our realm bleeds into yours. And Silas? Silas met his gaze, pulse still thrumming hard enough to feel in his fingertips. Don't bring anything you're not prepared to sacrifice. The journey to Velian's estate began mundanely enough. A sleek black car waiting outside Silas's studio, its driver human and unremarkable, the kind of face you'd forget the moment you looked away. Silas sat in the back seat with a single duffel bag of belongings, watching familiar streets slide past tinted windows. Velian sat beside him in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or making casual observations that did nothing to calm the anxiety coiling in Silas's gut. It wasn't until they'd been driving for nearly 2 hours, far beyond the city limits, deep into countryside Silas didn't recognize, that the ordinary began to fracture. The change was subtle at first. The air itself felt different, charged with electricity that made his hair stand on end. We're crossing over, Velian said quietly, noticing Silas's growing unease. The boundary between your world and mine isn't a line but a gradient, a slow dissolution. Each mile we travel takes us deeper into the realm of the Fae. Is it safe? Silas asked, then immediately felt foolish. Nothing about this was safe. For you? Under my protection? Velian's smile was reassuring and predatory in equal measure. Perfectly safe. Though I should warn you, the deeper we go, the more the realm will try to influence you. Your perceptions will alter. Your dreams will grow vivid. You may see things that aren't there, or fail to see things that are. It's nothing to be concerned about. The reassurance didn't land. Silas nodded anyway, not trusting his voice. Through the car windows, he watched the landscape transform. Gone were the familiar fields and forests of the mortal world, replaced by bioluminescent trees and flowers that Silas didn't recognize. The sky above deepened to purple, studded with unfamiliar stars. It's incredible, Silas breathed, and meant it. The artist in him was already cataloging this new world, imagining how he might capture such beauty in stone, even though he knew he'd fail. When Thornwick Manor finally came into view, it stole what little breath Silas had left. The estate defied physics. Spires twisted impossibly upward, their surfaces reflecting light that came from no visible source. Gardens sprawled in geometric patterns that made his eyes water when he tried to trace them, filled with plants that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Welcome to Thornwick Manor, Velian said as the car glided to a stop before the main entrance. My ancestral home. Silas climbed out on unsteady legs, overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of everything around him. The air smelled of night-blooming jasmine and petrichor, that after rain scent, electric and alive. When he breathed it in, energy rushed through him. It made his fingertips tingle and feel more awake than he'd ever been. The studio is in the east wing, Velian said, appearing at his elbow with effortless grace. I thought you might want to see it before you settle in. They walked through corridors that shifted when Silas wasn't looking directly at them, past tapestries that moved with their own silent stories and portraits whose eyes followed with too much awareness. Servants, human or fae, Silas couldn't tell, moved like shadows through the halls, acknowledged by Velian with casual nods that they returned with deep bows. The studio, when they finally reached it, was enormous. Vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow above. Windows along one wall offered views of gardens locked in perpetual twilight, neither day nor night but something between. The rest of the space was devoted to his craft. Tools of every description hung from walls or lay arranged on workbenches with meticulous care. Some he recognized. Others were clearly Fey-made, implements that seemed to hum with their own energy. But the obsidian commanded his attention. The block stood in the center of the room like a monolith, easily 8 feet tall. Its surface was so dark it absorbed light, creating a void in reality itself. Looking at it, Silas felt that familiar flutter of recognition, stronger than ever before, a pull so intense, it was almost physical. Magnificent, isn't it? Valian's voice was soft, reverent. This obsidian was formed in the first volcanic eruption of our realm, when chaos and order were still locked in their primal dance. It has been waiting centuries for the right artist to give it purpose. Silas approached the block slowly. When he reached out to touch its surface, the obsidian was warm despite its darkness, and something like electricity passed between stone and flesh. Recognition, hunger, greeting. For just a moment, he heard something. A voice, distant and amused, whispering words in a language he didn't understand. The sound sent shivers down his spine and heat pooling low in his belly. "Did you hear that?" he asked, pulling his hand back quickly. Valian's smile was knowing, satisfied. "The stone recognizes you, Silas. As I knew it would. You are the artist it has been waiting for." Silas stared at the obsidian, at the tools arranged around it like offerings, at the studio that seemed designed specifically for him, for this work, this resurrection. Everything was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, but undeniably what he had always dreamed of. "I'll let you rest tonight," Valian said, moving toward the door. "Tomorrow, we can discuss specifics of what I'm looking for in the finished piece. But for now," he paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the corridor's dim light. "Welcome to your new home, Silas Blackwell. I have a feeling you're going to create something extraordinary here." Valian. Valian watched from the doorway as Silas circled the obsidian like a moth drawn to dark flame, satisfaction settling warm in his chest. The mortal was perfect, talented enough to do justice to the work, naive enough to be guided, and appealing enough to make the game interesting. Appealing. Yes, that was the word. Not in the way the Fae prized beauty, but in the way broken things could be compelling. There was something fragile about Silas Blackwell. Something that begged to be either protected or corrupted. Valian had always preferred corruption. He'd spent the evening observing the mortal's reactions, cataloguing each flutter of fear, each spark of desire. Silas wanted this. The opportunity, the recognition, the chance to create something transcendent. But more than that, he wanted Valian himself, though he was far too shy to acknowledge it, too human to understand what that want would cost. The realization was intoxicating. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him with such unguarded fascination, such transparent hunger. The Fae court was full of creatures who guarded their desires like state secrets, who traded in careful manipulations and calculated seductions. Silas's artless attraction was refreshing in its honesty. And useful. Very useful indeed. Valian stepped back into the corridor, allowing the studio door to close with a soft whisper. Tomorrow, he would begin in earnest the delicate work of shaping his sculptor into the perfect instrument for his purposes. The next evening found Valian in his private chambers, preparing for what he'd come to think of as the second act of his seduction. Not the seduction of Silas's body, that would come later, when the mortal was more thoroughly under his influence. No, this was the seduction of the artist, the careful cultivation of obsession that would drive Silas to pour his very soul into the obsidian. He'd chosen his wardrobe with care. A shirt of midnight blue silk that brought out the violet in his eyes, cut to cling without being obvious about it. Dark trousers that emphasized the length of his legs, the predatory grace of his movements. Nothing overtly sexual, but everything calculated to catch and hold a mortal's attention. The game was delicate. Too much pressure, and Silas would bolt like a startled deer. Too little, and the mortal might grow comfortable, might begin to see him as merely another patron, rather than the dangerous creature he was. The key was to keep Silas off balance, constantly aware of the power dynamic between them while allowing him just enough agency to feel complicit in his own corruption. Valian made his way through the twisting corridors of Thornwick Manor, noting with mild amusement how the servants scattered before him. They could sense his mood tonight, the predatory satisfaction that hummed through his aura like electricity. He found Silas exactly where he'd expected, standing before the obsidian block with intense concentration, as if trying to decode its secrets through will alone. The mortal had changed into simple work clothes, dark hair tied back to keep it from his face. "As I expected," Valian said, stepping into the studio with calculated casualness. "You're besotted." Silas startled, spinning around with wide eyes. "Lord Duskshade, I didn't hear you come in." "Valian," he corrected with a smile designed to disarm. "We're going to be working closely together, Silas. Formality seems rather pointless, don't you think?" A flush crept up the mortal's neck, and Valian felt a moment of deep satisfaction. So responsive. So perfectly suited to his purposes. "I've been studying the stone," Silas said, turning back to the obsidian, as if it was safer than looking at Valian directly. "Trying to understand its nature. Obsidian is volcanic glass, it forms when lava cools rapidly. But this..." He reached out to touch the surface, then pulled his hand back as if the stone had burned him. "This feels different. Alive almost." "It is alive, in its way." Valian moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, enough to feel the heat radiating from Silas's body. "This obsidian was born in the fires of creation, when our realm was young and the boundaries between matter and spirit were less defined. It remembers what it was meant to become." "What was it meant to become?" "A vessel." Valian let his voice drop to something intimate, hypnotic, the subharmonic resonance that mortal ears couldn't quite process, but mortal bodies responded to. "A form that could house divinity. The question is whether you're artist enough to help it achieve that purpose." Silas's breath caught, and Valian could practically feel the mortal's pulse quicken. "I don't know if I'm skilled enough for work like this. I've never carved obsidian before. The smallest mistake could shatter the entire piece." "Skill can be taught," Valian said, moving around the block slowly, forcing Silas to turn to follow his movement, keeping the mortal slightly off balance. "What cannot be taught is vision. The ability to see what wants to be born and give it form. That, my dear sculptor, is a gift you possess in abundance." "How can you be so certain?" Valian paused directly in front of him, violet eyes fixed on Silas's face with unnerving intensity. "Because I've seen your work. You have a gift, Silas. A connection to forces beyond mortal understanding. But I can provide guidance." "What kind of guidance?" Valian smiled, allowing a hint of predatory satisfaction to show through. "The kind that comes from intimate knowledge of your subjects. You've captured our likenesses from imagination and instinct. But imagine what you could create, if you truly understood us. If you knew the texture of our skin, the architecture of our bones, the way power moves through our bodies like blood through veins." Silas's eyes widened, and Valian could see the moment when the mortal understood what he was offering. The flush that had been creeping up his neck spread to his cheeks, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. I couldn't. It wouldn't be appropriate." "Appropriate." Valian laughed, the sound rich and dark. "My dear Silas, we are far beyond the realm of human propriety. You're in my domain now, working on my commission. The only question is whether you want to create something merely good, or something transcendent." He began to circle Silas slowly, letting the silence stretch. "I could describe Nitharos to you in words. His height, his build, the angle of his cheekbones. But words are pale things, inadequate to capture the reality of divine flesh. How much better would your sculpture be if you understood the form you're trying to recreate? If you'd studied it with your artist's eye, mapped it with your sculptor's hands? You're talking about using yourself as a model, Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm talking about giving you every advantage I can. Valian stopped directly behind him, so close that Silas could feel the hum of his presence. Nitharos and I share certain physical characteristics. The bone structure of our kind follows similar patterns, divine architecture that echoes through bloodlines. If you studied me, truly studied me, you'd understand how to shape the obsidian into something worthy of worship. Silas turned slowly, warily. Desire fought its way through the cracks in his composure, but propriety still clung stubbornly to his shoulders, like a cloak he couldn't quite shed. It would be professional, he said, as if trying to convince himself. Artistic study, nothing more. Of course. Valian's smile was gentle, reassuring. Too gentle, too reassuring. A lie wrapped in silk. Nothing more than art. He began unfastening his shirt with the practiced grace of someone used to being watched, but rarely, if ever, truly seen. The fine black fabric parted like water, slipping over pale skin with unnatural ease, each button revealing more of what lay beneath. Silas's breath caught audibly. Valian was built like no human model. Geometry made erotic. Lean muscle pulled like silk over carved bone, and beneath the skin glimmered faint, shifting patterns that pulsed with light not sourced from any lamp in the room. I would show you perfection, Valian murmured, watching Silas's pupils dilate with hunger. So that you might understand it runs soul deep. So that you might carve not just beauty, but truth. And then, with a breath of air that was neither wind nor sound but something between, his wings unfurled. Silas flinched backward, gasping. They weren't feathered. They were something else entirely, something mortal eyes weren't meant to perceive. Membranous and translucent, like silk dipped in oil and stretched across shadow bone. Each wing extended outward from Valian's back, delicate and terrifying, sacred and profane. The edges shimmered with iridescence, catching light. These are not meant to be seen by mortals, Valian said quietly, letting genuine truth bleed into his voice for the first time. Even among the Fae, wings are intimate, sacred. We do not expose them casually. They are not ornamental. They are distinct and a part of our identity made manifest. I am breaking custom just by showing you. Silas's eyes were wide, his hands half lifted as if uncertain whether he was allowed to look, whether looking itself was a transgression. Why? He whispered. Because I want you to understand, Valian said. And this too was true, in its way. Not just anatomy or aesthetics. I want you to feel what we are, what Netharos is. He was made to be seen in ways the world forgot how to look. He stepped closer, and the wings curled behind him in a slow ripple, folding halfway like petals closing around heat. Touch me. Silas hesitated, hand hovering in the air, trembling. Valian reached for it, gently, reverently, with a tenderness he only half faked, and placed it against his chest. The contact burned. Mortal warmth met Fae stillness, and created static, electricity that hummed through Silas's skin into his teeth, into his bones. Feel how the muscle attaches to bone, Valian said, voice dropping into velvet. The way power coils beneath the skin. Not just strength, control. This is what you must give the god you carve. Not merely the image of divinity, but the tension that holds it together. Silas's fingers moved over his collarbone with reverent hesitation, and traveled down his sternum. His gaze drank in the alien beauty, the wrongness that made everything inside him tighten with fascination and fear. Don't be afraid, Valian said, drawing Silas's touch higher, to the curve of his throat to feel his pulse. Art requires courage, and your dreams have already given you a taste of blasphemy. Silas didn't respond. Perhaps he couldn't. His hand moved up to trace the edge of a wing where it attached to Valian's back, and the moment his fingers brushed that soft membrane, Valian shuddered. Not from pain. From sensations so intense it bordered on pain. From feeling he hadn't expected and couldn't quite control. The wings trembled. Velian's voice came out quieter, rougher. That's enough. Silas pulled back immediately, heart hammering, eyes wide with something between guilt and hunger. Velian folded the wings away slowly, with visible effort. Not embarrassment. He was beyond that, had trained himself past it centuries ago. Vulnerability weaponized and turned into seduction. You saw too much, he said, and allowed himself to sound uncertain. Allowed the mask to slip just enough. But perhaps that was always the point. Silas's fingers still trembled at his sides. What does it mean? He asked. That you let me see them. It means I trust you, Valian said. And that was the biggest lie of all. He reached for his shirt, noting with deep satisfaction how Silas's eyes followed every movement as he dressed. How the mortal's breath came fast and shallow, caught between artistic inspiration and carnal desire in a way that was absolutely perfect for Valian's purposes. Tomorrow, he said, fastening the last button, we'll begin the work in earnest. Tonight, let what you've learned settle into your mind. Dream of the forms that wait within the obsidian to be born. He moved toward the door, then paused at the threshold for maximum effect. And Silas? If you need to study me again, you have only to ask. I am, as I said, entirely at your disposal. Silas. Left alone in the studio, Silas stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. They still trembled, still burned with the memory of touching something he shouldn't have touched. He could feel the ghost of Valian's skin under his fingertips. But worse, far worse, was the memory of the wings. The way the membrane had pulsed under his touch. The way one had curled around his wrist not to restrain but to keep, to hold, to claim. It felt like he'd touched something sacred, and stolen from it. His gaze drifted to the slab of obsidian at the center of the room. He hadn't meant to approach it yet, was still too full of want, of confusion, of hunger. But his feet were already moving, carrying him forward against whatever remained of his better judgment. He reached out. The moment his fingers met the surface, a shiver traveled through the stone, and through him. A voice coiled up from the depths of the block. Silas. The name was a purr and a breath and a promise, all layered together. He gasped, staggered back a step, but didn't remove his hand. Couldn't. The stone wasn't just responding to him. It was answering him. The voice came again, low and amused, speaking in no language he knew yet understanding flooded through him anyway. You touched a prince of my blood. But you still yearn for a taste. Soon, my sculptor. Soon, you will give me form. And I will quench your thirst. The words struck like lightning through deep water. Lust and awe tangled in his chest, and his hands, God. His hands ached to begin, buzzed with memory of bone and sinew, wings and pulse, secrets and structure he shouldn't know but somehow did. He yanked them back suddenly, as if the stone might bite, might consume him if he touched it any longer. Outside the tall, arched windows, the Fey realm settled deeper into its eternal twilight. But in the black heart of the obsidian, something ancient and hungry stirred. Chapter 3. Silas. Silas woke with a metallic taste on his tongue, like licking the edge of a blade. A phantom sensation clung to his fingertips, warm and languid. He lay in an unfamiliar bed, trying to separate dream from memory, but the boundaries had dissolved like watercolor bleeding across wet paper, and all he had left was an ache, a wanting. The guest quarters Valian had provided were obscenely luxurious, but comfort couldn't touch the restlessness thrumming through his veins and the hunger coiling in his gut. He needed to work. Soon, whispered a voice that might have been his own thoughts if it hadn't continued. Soon, my sculptor. Silas dressed quickly in his work clothes, and made his way through Thornwick's twisting corridors. The house felt different in the pre-dawn hours. Shadows pulled deeper in corners, whispers grew louder in empty holes, as if the building itself was most alive when its inhabitants slept. The studio was exactly as he'd left it, but the obsidian pulsed with inner light, in the strange violet glow that passed for morning. Silas approached it slowly, fingers already twitching. When he touched the volcanic glass, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Heat shot up his arms like lightning finding ground, and his vision blurred, showing him not the rough block, but a figure emerging from its shadow. Tall, imposing, with eyes like burning stars and a smile that promised ecstasy and destruction in equal measure. "Yes," the voice whispered. And this time there was no mistaking it. "You see me. You understand." "Nitharos," Silas breathed, and the name felt like prayer on his lips. "My sculptor, my priest, begin the work." His hands moved without conscious direction, selecting tools with muscle memory. The obsidian was harder than marble, required different techniques entirely, but somehow his body knew exactly what to do. The first strike of hammer against chisel sent sparks flying, and each subsequent blow revealed more of the form waiting within. Time became irrelevant. His world narrowed to the space between chisel and stone. "Faster," the voice urged. "You can work faster. Let me guide you." And Silas found that he could. His movements became precise beyond any skill he'd earned, each strike of the chisel revealing exactly the right amount of stone. No more, no less. It was as if invisible hands covered his own, as if centuries of knowledge flowed through mortal fingers that shouldn't have been capable of this work. He was so absorbed that he didn't hear the studio door open, didn't notice Velion's presence until the Fey Lord spoke. "Your progress astounds me. A single day's work shouldn't have achieved this much." Silas spun around, chisel still in hand, and felt the world tilt. Had it really been only a day? Looking at the sculpture, the clearly defined figure that had emerged from the obsidian, it seemed impossible. This represented weeks of labor, not hours. "I brought you breakfast," Velion continued, setting a tray on one of the workbenches. His violet eyes held concern mixed with something else, something that looked like calculation. "Though I suspect you haven't noticed time passing." "What time is it?" Silas asked, his voice hoarse from disuse, from breathing stone dust, from hours of silence broken only by the rhythm of hammer on chisel. "Nearly noon. You've been working for 18 hours without pause." Velion studied him with that unreadable Fey expression. "When did you last eat, sleep?" The question seemed to come from very far away, as if Velion was speaking from the other side of a vast distance. Food and sleep were mortal concerns, and right now, Silas felt anything but mortal. Power thrummed through his veins. Divine inspiration that made earthly needs seem pale and insignificant, like shadows cast by a dying sun. "I'm not hungry," he said, already turning back to the sculpture. There was still so much to do. The face needed definition, the hands required delicate work, and the torso needed to capture the exact interplay of muscle and shadow that would make observers understand they were looking upon a god, not merely a statue. "Silas." Velion's voice carried an edge of command that made Silas pause despite himself. "You need to eat. Mortal bodies have limitations, even when touched by inspiration." "Don't stop," whispered the voice in his mind, insistent as a heartbeat. "The work is more important than flesh. Continue." But Velion was already moving closer, his presence impossible to ignore even with divine whispers filling Silas's head. "Come, sit with me. The obsidian will wait." Reluctantly, fighting against the pull to keep working, to finish, to complete, Silas set down his tools and moved to where Velion had arranged a simple meal. Bread that smelled of honey and grain. Cheese that tasted of summer grass. Wine that sparkled with its own inner light, Fey-made and potent. The moment he stopped working, exhaustion crashed over him like a wave. His hands shook as he reached for the wine. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. His shoulders ached, his back cramped, His fingers were raw from gripping tools for hours without rest. Better, Valion murmured approvingly, as Silas forced himself to eat, to drink, to acknowledge that his body still had needs, even if his mind wanted to transcend them. Though I must say, your skill is unparalleled. I've never seen anyone work with such confidence. It feels like the stone wants to be shaped, Silas said, glancing back at the sculpture despite himself. Even partially complete, it was stunning. A divine form emerging from darkness like a star being born from the void. Like it's been waiting for someone to set it free. And what do you see when you look at it? Silas studied the emerging figure, trying to put into words what his hands had known instinctively, what the voice had whispered to him in the dark. Power, he said finally. Velion's smile was knife-edged with satisfaction that he tried and failed to hide. Perfect. That is exactly what Nitharos represents. The chaos that the courts feared, the wild magic they sought to tame, and failed to destroy. Tell me about him, Silas said, surprising himself with the request, with how much he wanted to know more about the god whose voice filled his head, whose hands seemed to guide his own. About who he was, what he did that made them fear him so much. Nitharos was... Valion paused, as if choosing his words with extreme care. Imagined desire given form and will. Passion without restraint or shame. He was worshipped not just for his beauty, but for his ability to awaken the deepest hunger in those who served him. Mortal and Fae alike would compete for his attention, would offer everything they had, their art, their bodies, their souls, for just a taste of his divine favor. The wine was making Silas light-headed. Or perhaps it was the lingering effects of his extended work session, or perhaps it was something else entirely. The Fae magic that permeated this place, the god's influence seeping into his blood. What happened to his worshippers when he was bound? They were dealt with. Valion's expression darkened. The courts don't tolerate competition for devotion. Those who wouldn't renounce him were executed or driven mad. His temples were destroyed, his name stricken from official records. They tried to erase him completely. But they failed, Silas said softly. They failed, Valion agreed. Because obsession like that doesn't die. It just waits, dormant, until someone comes along who understands what was lost. Silas felt the truth of those words resonate in his chest, felt it echo the voice that whispered to him from the stone. He's not dormant anymore, is he? Valion's violet eyes met his, and for a moment, the Fae Lord's careful mask slipped. No, he admitted. I suspect he's been stirring, preparing for his return. Good, Silas said, and meant it with an intensity that should have frightened him but didn't. He stood, leaving the meal half finished, and moved back toward the sculpture. His exhaustion had vanished, burned away by renewed hunger to work, to create, to bring forth what had been hidden for so long. The work calls to me, he said to Valion without looking back. I need to continue. If Valion protested, Silas didn't hear it. His hands had already found tools, and the chisel was already biting into stone. Hours blurred into each other. Or perhaps days. Silas worked in a trance state, his conscious mind barely present while something else guided his hands. The voice in the obsidian had grown stronger, more insistent, whispering instructions in that language he shouldn't understand, but somehow did. Yes, it purred as Silas's chisel revealed the curve of a shoulder. Perfect. You see me so clearly. The cheekbone should be higher. There, yes. Don't fear the delicate work. Your hands are steady. Trust them. And strangest of all, you've touched a prince of my blood. You know the architecture of desire. Show me what you have learned. That last whisper made Silas pause, chisel hovering over the sculpture's emerging face. Valion. The memory of touching him. Cool skin stretched over in human bone structure. The impossible smoothness. The way his wings had trembled under Silas's fingers, flooded back with visceral intensity. I understand, Silas murmured to the stone, to the voice, to himself. You want me use what I learned. I want you to claim what you learned, the voice corrected. And there was amusement in it, dark and rich. The Fae hoard their beauty, their power, their secrets. But you touched one, studied him. That knowledge is yours now. Heat coiled in Silas's belly at the words, and his hands moved with renewed purpose. The face was beginning to emerge now, features of impossible beauty that made his chest ache just to look at. Eyes that would soon hold fires of creation. Lips that would speak words of power and passion, that would consume and create in equal measure. Soon, the voice whispered as exhaustion finally forced Silas to stop, as his hands cramped and his vision blurred. Soon you will touch me as you have touched him. Soon I will reward your devotion as it deserves. The promise sent shivers down Silas's spine, anticipation and fear braided together so tightly, he couldn't separate them. When he finally set down his tools, stumbling toward his quarters on unsteady legs, the sculpture had progressed far beyond all reasonable expectations. What stood in the center of the studio was no longer a rough form but a nearly complete figure. Nitharos, in all his terrible beauty, captured in volcanic glass that pulsed with its own inner light, that seemed to breathe in the violet twilight. Soon, the voice whispered as Silas collapsed into bed, fully clothed, too exhausted to undress. Soon we will finish the work. And then, my faithful sculptor, you will understand what it truly means to serve a god. In his dreams that night, shadowed hands caressed his skin with possessive certainty. The shadowed hands that found him were warm, calloused. They swept over his chest, thumbs circling his nipples until they peaked, then slipped lower, learning the lines of his stomach and the flex of his hips, as if he were the marble being shaped. A mouth found his, breath hot and tasting faintly of spice. A tongue probed past his lips and stole the soft sounds he made. Another hand traced the arch of his spine and settled at the small of his back, urging him to lift, to open. He did. Fingers stroked behind him, teasing until pressure became penetration, and he gasped, hips instinctively rolling to take more. The dream figure moved inside him with slow, relentless intent, the friction a pleasure that built and built, until he was panting and clutching at the sheets. All the while, a voice threaded through the sensations, rich and coaxing, promising that this surrender would remake him, would draw him into something bigger than himself. When his body finally shuddered and he fell apart around the touch, he felt himself dissolve into heat and light. He woke in the dim pre-dawn with his pulse still racing, his sheets damp with release, and a smile curving his lips. Chapter 4. Velion. Velion stood outside the studio door, listening to the rhythmic percussion of chisel against stone that had been echoing through Thornwick Manor for 3 days straight. The sound had become the estate's heartbeat, steady, relentless, hypnotic. The mortal hadn't emerged except for brief moments to eat or sleep before returning to his obsessive work with single-minded devotion that was both fascinating and deeply concerning. Concerning. The word sat wrong in Velion's mouth, bitter as iron. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? For Silas to become so absorbed in the work that he would pour his very soul into the obsidian, that he would serve as the perfect vessel for awakening. The plan was proceeding perfectly, perhaps too perfectly, too fast, too far beyond his control. There had been signs that something beyond mere artistic inspiration was driving the sculptor's work. The impossible speed of progress. The precision of detail that should have taken weeks, not days. The way Silas had physically intercepted him yesterday when he tried to touch the sculpture, blocking his path with a flash of authority in those formerly gentle eyes that had made Velion's breath catch. He had orchestrated this awakening with meticulous care, had calculated every variable, every risk. Except for how quickly Nitharos would begin to assert his influence. The god was supposed to remain dormant until the sculpture was complete, until Velion could perform the binding ritual that would give him control over the awakened deity. But the whispers he'd been hearing in the deeper parts of the manor, the electric charge that permeated the very air, all of it told another, far more dangerous story. No matter, he told himself, though the reassurance rang hollow even in his own thoughts. A god partially awakened is still a god that can be bound. And Silas is still mortal, still malleable. He opened the studio door, preparing to deploy the same mixture of charm and subtle manipulation that had served him so well thus far. What he found instead stopped him cold. The sculpture was nearly complete, only the finest details remaining. Nitharos stood captured in obsidian, every line speaking of power barely leashed within volcanic glass. The craftsmanship was flawless, better than anything Valion had seen in centuries of collecting art. But it wasn't the artwork that made his breath catch. It was Silas. The mortal stood before his creation with his back to the door, and even from behind, Valion could see that something fundamental had changed. Gone was the deferential hunch of shoulders that had marked all their previous interactions. Silas stood tall, spine straight as a blade, chisel in hand, moving with fluid confidence as he added microscopic details to the god's face. "You continue to astound me," Valion said, stepping into the studio and trying to find his footing in dynamics that had somehow shifted without his permission. "I'm beginning to think I should be jealous of that stone. It seems to command more of your devotion than anyone else." Silas didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he finished the delicate work he'd been doing around one of the sculpture's eyes. The kind of precise, minute adjustment that could take hours to get right. When he finally faced Valion, the transformation was even more striking. The shy artist was gone, replaced by someone who looked at the Fey Lord with eyes that held depths Valion hadn't seen before. Depths that reflected starlight and shadow, that saw too much and hid even more. "Valion," Silas said, and his voice carried a new quality that sent an unexpected shiver down the Fey Lord's spine. "I was wondering when you'd visit again." "I didn't want to interrupt your work," Valion replied, falling back on familiar patterns even as every instinct screamed that the dynamic between them had shifted in ways he didn't yet understand. "Though I confess, I'm eager to see the details you've added." Silas smiled, and it was an expression that belonged on the face of the god he was carving. Knowing, predatory, secure in its authority. "Would you like a closer look?" Before Valion could answer, Silas moved toward him with fluid grace that echoed his own Fey nature, but somehow surpassed it. Where Valion's movements were practiced performances honed over centuries, Silas moved with the unconscious authority of someone who knew exactly what effect he was having, and didn't need to calculate it. "The face is nearly complete," Silas continued, circling Valion slowly, forcing the Fey Lord to turn to track his movement. The reversal of their usual dynamic was so complete, it made Valion's pulse quicken. Every angle catches the light perfectly. Every curve speaks of divinity waiting to wake. But there are still details to be refined. He stopped directly in front of Valion, close enough that the scent surrounded them both. Stone dust and something else. Something that smelled like ozone and incense and sex. Something that made Valion's mouth water. "I've been thinking about what you said," Silas murmured. "About studying perfection so I might know it soul deep." Valion felt his composure slip, felt the careful mask he wore crack at the edges. This wasn't how their interactions were supposed to proceed. He was the one who controlled the pace of seduction, who guided mortal desire like a conductor. But looking into Silas's eyes, those eyes that seemed to hold knowledge no mortal should possess, he found himself uncertain for the first time in centuries. "Have you?" he managed, hating how his voice wavered. "Oh yes." Silas reached out, fingers brushing along Valion's jaw with reverent precision that belied the possession in his touch. "I've memorized every line of your face, every angle where shadow meets light. But memory fades, doesn't it? And the work requires absolute accuracy." Silas's fingers were warm against his skin, but underneath that mortal heat was power that thrummed like barely contained lightning. "What are you suggesting?" Valion asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew, already feared. Silas's smile was answer enough. "I think you know." This is wrong, Valion thought. But the protest was distant, muffled. He should be the one asking permission, seeking favor. I am the Fey Lord. I am the one with power in this arrangement. But even as the thoughts formed, he found himself unable to step away from Silas's touch, unable to reassert the control that had been his since the moment they'd first met. Something had changed in the mortal, or perhaps something had awakened that had always been there, coiled and patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. I need to understand the architecture of desire, Silas murmured, his fingers tracing the line of Valion's throat with an artist's precision but a conqueror's intent. How power moves through flesh, how divinity expresses itself in forms that can be touched. You offered to teach me, didn't you? The Fae hoarded their power, their lust, their gifts, whispered a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, that resonated in the obsidian and the air and Valion's bones. But I am owed. Your seed is mine. The words weren't spoken aloud, but Valion heard them with perfect clarity. And looking into Silas's eyes, he realized with a mixture of terror and fascination that the mortal had heard them too, or perhaps had spoken them himself. The boundary between Silas and Nitharos was dissolving like sugar in water. Nitharos, Valion breathed. Among others, Silas agreed, and his smile was knowing and terrible and beautiful. But right now, I'm more interested in you, in what you can teach me about the nature of power between bodies. Before Valion could respond, Silas's hands were on his chest, pushing him backward with strength that should have been impossible for a mortal to possess. Valion found himself pressed against the wall of the studio, stone dust coating his expensive clothes, obsidian fragments digging into his shoulders, while Silas looked at him with eyes that burned with borrowed starlight. This isn't, Valion began, but Silas silenced him with a finger pressed to his lips. The touch was gentle, but absolute. Psh, the mortal whispered, and there was divine authority in the sound, centuries of command compressed into a single syllable. You wanted to give me inspiration, didn't you? To show me what perfection looks like. Silas's hands moved to the fastenings of Valion's shirt, and the Fey Lord found himself unable to protest, unable to do anything but submit to touch that felt like worship and conquest braided together. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He was the one with power, the one who controlled the pace of seduction, the one who decided when and how and with whom. But as Silas's hands mapped his chest with reverent precision, as mortal lips pressed against the pulse point at his throat, the vulnerable place where life beat closest to the surface, Valion realized that control had never truly been his. From the moment he'd chosen Silas Blackwell as his instrument, from the moment he'd allowed mortal hands to touch the obsidian, the outcome had been inevitable. So perfect in your arrogance, Silas murmured against his skin, and the words carried harmonics that spoke of ages beyond mortal comprehension, of power that had slept for centuries and was now stretching, waking, claiming. So certain of your own superiority. But power is meant to be claimed, isn't it? Taken by those strong enough to seize it. Valion's protests died in his throat as Silas sank to his knees, smooth, controlled, the motion of someone who knew exactly how powerful submission could look when wielded as a weapon. His hands worked at the fastenings of Valion's trousers with practiced efficiency. The position should have been one of supplication, of service. But the way Silas looked up at him, eyes bright with hunger and triumph, made it absolutely clear who held control in this moment. The Fae believe themselves above mortal desire, Silas said, his voice carrying undertones that seemed to resonate in Valion's bones, in his blood, in the hollow places where his pride used to live. But you're not above it, are you? You want this. You've wanted it since the moment you first saw me at the gallery, standing in the shadows, covered in stone dust and fear. It was true. Valion had been drawn to the mortal's quiet beauty, to his artistic passion, to his complete lack of awareness of his own appeal. But this transformation, this confidence, this power, it was beyond anything he could have anticipated or prepared for. Please, he whispered, and wasn't sure if he was asking Silas to stop or to continue, wasn't sure if he even knew the difference anymore. Please what? Silas's hands stilled, his eyes fixed on Velian's face with predatory patience. "What is it you want, Lord Duskshade? What would you beg for?" The words were like a slap, shocking Velian into awareness of how far he'd fallen from his position of control. A lord of the Shadow Court, reduced to pleading with a mortal sculptor. The humiliation should have snapped him back to his senses, should have sparked the anger needed to reassert his authority, to remember who and what he was. Instead, it sent fire through his veins. Shame and arousal twisted together until he couldn't separate them. Until he didn't want to. "Touch me," he gasped, pride crumbling in the face of need that burned hotter than shame, brighter than fear. "Please, just..." "Good," Silas purred, and the approval in his voice was like a physical caress, like a hand wrapped around Valian's throat, in a grip that could kill or pleasure with equal ease. "Honesty suits you better than arrogance." When Silas's mouth closed around him, Valian's mind went white with sensation so intense, it bordered on pain. The mortal's touch was reverent but demanding, worshipful but claiming. And underneath it all was that thrumming power that spoke of divine will, made manifest through mortal flesh. "Mine," whispered the voice that wasn't quite Silas, wasn't quite Nitharus, wasn't quite anything Valian could name. The Fey Lord's pride, his power, his essence, all mine to claim. Valian's hands tangled in Silas's dark hair, torn between pushing him away and pulling him closer. Fey Lords weren't meant to be touched with such casual authority, such presumption of ownership, but the wrongness of it only made the pleasure more intense, the surrender more complete, more devastating. "That's right," Silas murmured, and the vibration of his voice sent shockwaves through Valian's body. "Give me everything. Your pleasure, your power, your precious Fey essence. It all belongs to me now." The words pushed Valian over the edge. Pleasure crashed through him with an intensity that bordered on violent, that felt like being unmade and remade in the same breath. He came with a name on his lips. Silas's or Nitharus's, or perhaps his own. He couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't think through the white-hot blaze of release. When awareness returned, slowly, reluctantly, Valian found himself still pressed against the wall, trembling with aftershocks that felt like small earthquakes in his bones. Silas rose to his feet with liquid grace, and the otherworldly light in his eyes had intensified. There was satisfaction there now, a sense of hunger partially sated but far from satisfied. "Thank you," Silas said, and his voice carried genuine warmth beneath the divine authority, as if he actually meant the courtesy. That was educational. Valian stared at him, still trying to process what had just occurred, trying to reassemble the shattered pieces of his understanding. The quiet, deferential artist was gone, if he'd ever truly existed at all, replaced by something that wore Silas's face, but moved with the confidence of divinity itself, that spoke with borrowed power, or perhaps power that had always been there, sleeping. "What are you?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer, had known it the moment Silas's hands touched him, with such certainty. Silas smiled, and it was both tender and terrible, gentle and absolute. "I am what you made me, Valian, the instrument of awakening, the sculptor who gives form to forgotten gods." He turned back toward the obsidian figure, which seemed to pulse with its own inner light in the studio's strange illumination, seemed to breathe in time with Silas's chest. "And soon, when the work is finished, I will be so much more." Left alone as Silas returned to his carving, the sound of chisel on stone resuming as if nothing had happened, as if Valian's world hadn't just been inverted, the Fey Lord struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had just transpired. His carefully laid plans were crumbling, his control over the situation slipping away with each strike of chisel against obsidian. The god he had hoped to bind was already asserting his influence, using the mortal sculptor as a conduit for power that had been dormant for centuries, but was dormant no longer. But as he watched Silas move with fluid grace, with confidence in every gesture, with divine certainty in every strike of the hammer, Valian found that terror was not the only emotion coursing through his veins. There was anticipation too, and fascination, and something that felt dangerously close to worship. The Fey Lord had sought to awaken a god for his own purposes, to bind divinity to his will, and restore his house's fortunes. But gods, once awakened, served no master but themselves. And as the obsidian sculpture neared completion, as Netharos prepared to step free from his volcanic glass prison, Velion began to understand that he had never been the one in control. Chapter 5. Velion. Velion stood alone before the gilt mirror in his private chamber, fingers worrying at the knot of his cravat until the silk frayed. Moonlight filtered through carved mullions and turned the panes to pale silver, but it could not soften the tightness coiled in his stomach. Beyond his window, the gravel drive echoed with the arrival of coaches and the bright chiming of conversation as members of the Shadow Court began to fill Thornwick Manor. These monthly gatherings were usually a stage on which he delighted in performing, an opportunity to display his taste, his wealth, his mastery of courtly games. Tonight, the anticipation sat like a stone in his gut. 3 days had passed since the studio. 3 sleepless nights of replaying every humiliating second in maddening detail. Silas's hands pinning him to rough stone, the mortal's calm authority as he spoke, the way Velion's own body had responded with feverish eagerness. Each memory was a visceral imprint, palms pressing against his shoulders, the rasp of breath at his ear, his knees weakening as his carefully cultivated composure shattered. "What are you?" he had whispered against Silas's mouth. And the question haunted him now, looping with every heartbeat. Whatever lived behind Silas's dark eyes, whatever he was becoming, it moved with a will that was no longer his to shape. He had devoted decades to researching the binding ritual, to scouring forgotten libraries, and coaxing secrets from ancient beings. Every assumption he'd made hinged on containing a newborn god in the first moments of its incarnation. But in the studio, he had felt Netharos awake through Silas's skin. If the god's consciousness was already stretching into the world, perhaps those carefully laid contingencies were nothing more than ink on parchment. A soft knock pulled him back from his spiraling thoughts. He smoothed his features into practiced indifference before calling, "Enter." A footman in livery bowed low. "My lord, the first guests have arrived. Lady Morwen and Lord Thane await you in the blue salon." "Thank you. I'll be down shortly." He watched his reflection after the door closed, noting signs he'd never allowed himself to display. Violet irises too bright, cheekbones sharpened by strain, the faint tremor of his left hand. Fey beauty hid much, but stress marked him like anyone else. He forced his shoulders back and turned toward the corridor. As he walked, he felt the manor's stones hum under his boots. Shadows seemed thicker at the edges of tapestries. The air itself carried a metallic taste. The awakening in the east wing reverberated through Thornwick like a heartbeat, bending reality in ways only he could sense. He had to be perfect tonight. His house reputation and his place within the court depended upon it. The blue salon glowed with candlelight when he entered. Velvet-draped walls showcased portraits of his ancestors, and the air was already fragrant with incense and spiced wine. Lady Morwen drifted toward him in a gown of midnight silk that swallowed light, her smile bright and cutting. "Velion," she purred, extending fingers heavy with rings. "You look taut as a drawn bow. Has some new obsession captured your attention?" He took her hand and brushed his lips over her knuckles, the gesture automatic. "Only the usual anxieties of a host. I have no desire to bore such illustrious company." Lord Thane's laugh chimed like bells. "As if you could. Your gatherings are whispered about for weeks." More nobles flowed in, a sweep of shimmering gowns and cold smiles. Velion moved among them, dispensing compliments, laughing in the right places. Yet a portion of his awareness remained anchored to the East Wing studio, and the mortal he had tried to make a tool. He told himself Silas was too consumed by marble and chisel to appear tonight. He told himself a mortal had no place among the court. A sliver of hope fractured when Lady Morwen appeared at his elbow with a towering figure in tow. "Allow me to present Lord Aurelius of the Dawn Realm," she said. "He is on diplomatic business." Valion turned and felt his throat tighten. Aurelius was tall and radiant, golden hair catching candlelight, amber eyes warm as summer. The Dawn Lord's beauty had always drawn admiration, but tonight it filled Valion with unease he could not place. "Lord Duskshade." Aurelius's voice carried a lilt from the other side of the world. "I've heard much of your soirees. Thank you for your invitation." "The honor is mutual," Valion replied, though his smile felt brittle. That cold coil in his stomach twisted as the Dawn Lord's gaze swept the room in lazy assessment. It sharpened as the air shifted. Conversation ebbed. In the doorway, silhouetted against the hall's warmth, stood Silas Blackwell. Valion's pulse kicked hard. The artist he'd commissioned was transformed. No marble dust streaked his hands. No curls of hair fell across his brow. He wore fitted black silk that outlined the lean strength of his body. His dark hair was swept back to reveal sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked softer than it had any right to. But it was his eyes that held the room. They were deeper than before, as if starfields had taken up residence behind his irises. When he looked at the assembled Fae, it felt as though he was measuring them and finding them wanting. "My lords and ladies," Valion managed, voice steady by sheer will. "Allow me to present Silas Blackwell, the artist currently engaged on a piece of some significance to me." Predatory attention snapped towards Silas. Usually, the presence of a mortal in such company would elicit polite disdain or amused curiosity. Tonight, there was hunger threaded through the interest, an instinctual recognition. Skin prickled along Valion's spine. Lady Morwen's smile widened, sharp as a blade. "How extraordinary," she murmured, drawing closer to Silas as though to a fire. "There is something about you. I can't decide whether it's your confidence or something in your eyes, but it calls to me." "You could say that," Silas replied, his voice smooth. Valion caught the faintest harmonic beneath the words, a resonance that made his breath hitch. Those around Silas leaned in, drawn as much by the unseen current in his voice as by his beauty. Lord Aurelius joined them with effortless grace, warmth radiating from him like a summer morning. "An artist," he observed, eyes lingering on Silas's hands. "What a delightful addition to our circle." The way he said delightful sent a warning through Valion's veins. The Dawn Lord was as curious as a cat, and twice as indulgent. Valion attempted to guide the gathering toward the dining room, to divert attention away from the mortal who had so quickly become the room's center of gravity. Plates of food, the promise of music, none of it mattered. Conversation swirled tighter around Silas until there was nothing else. Silas. Crossing the threshold of the blue salon felt like stepping into warm water. The air was heavy with perfume and old magic, every fey eye turning toward him. Where once their beauty would have struck him dumb, now it merely painted a pleasing backdrop. The voice that had become a constant presence, the voice he now understood as Netharos, murmured approval inside his skull. "See how they watch," Netharos whispered. Even without understanding, they sense the shift. They smell power and hunger for it. Valion's introduction floated over him, and Silas smiled because it felt right, not because he felt compelled to please. The names and titles that followed blurred together. Lord this, Lady that. Only one face truly held his interest, the Golden Lord from the Dawn Court, whose warmth made the hairs along Silas's arms stand on end. "That one," Netharos purred. "The sun is a fitting offering for a creature of shadow." Silas moved through the crowd with an ease he had never felt at a mortal gathering. Compliments slipped from his tongue, his laughter came easily, yet he never forgot who he was, or what he was becoming. He could feel eyes on his back and the faint brush of desire against his skin like static. When Lord Aurelius asked about his medium, Silas answered honestly. Stone, always stone, though the materials of his work were expanding in ways he had never imagined. The wine pressed into his hand tasted of honey and rain, its magic effervescent on his tongue. The evening unfolded as if by design. The company drifted from the salon to the dining room, and then, as wine loosened tongues, to a more intimate parlor. Plush cushions, low tables, and dim lanterns encouraged closeness. Silas felt Nitharos gather in his chest, pressure building until his skin seemed to hum. Now, the voice urged. Show them beauty in its rawest form. Silas stepped into the center of the room. He felt every gaze land on him as he reached for the fastenings of his shirt. Silk slid over his knuckles, the fabric whispering as it fell away. He heard Valian's sharp intake of breath, heard the faint panic that sharpened his host's voice when he asked, "What are you doing?" "Creating," Silas answered simply. The word vibrated through the room. Candlelight kissed his bare skin, turning the lean planes of his chest into sculpture. He could feel the air itself grow thick as the nobles leaned closer. No one moved to stop him. Valian stood frozen, every muscle in his face tight with the effort of maintaining composure. It would have been almost funny, if not for the rush of power coursing through Silas's veins. He unfastened the rest of his clothing with steady hands and stepped out of it, naked under the flickering lanterns. He felt no shame, only awareness of the way the room's attention sharpened, how each pair of eyes reflected back a different desire. He reclined on a low table draped in velvet, arranging his limbs deliberately the way he might pose a model in the studio. Then he beckoned, a crook of his finger that drew gasps. Lord Aurelius answered first. Golden skin flushed, he approached with the cautious reverence of someone approaching a temple altar. "You're extraordinary," he breathed. "Come closer and see," Silas replied, voice wrapping around the words like silk. He guided the Dawn Lord with sure touches, fingers against his jaw, a palm at the base of his throat. Every caress made clear who led and who followed. Around them, the other nobles watched with bright, hungry eyes. Lady Morwen's lips were slightly parted, Lord Thane's throat bobbed as he swallowed. The air was thick with arousal and unspoken challenge. Silas's awareness of Valian burned at the edge of his vision. The Shadow Lord hovered, violet eyes wild, jaw clenched hard enough to crack. When Valian surged forward to intercept, placing himself between Silas and Aurelius, the movement was driven by something primal. Rage, jealousy, fear. Silas rose smoothly from the table. He stepped into Valian's space, and let his hand close around the Lord's throat, not choking, but enough pressure to command his attention. He looked up into eyes that had once glittered with mocking superiority, and now held desperation. "Did I ask for your protection?" he asked quietly, the question as sharp as a knife. He felt Valian's pulse flutter against his palm. "You cannot," Valian began, but the words dissolved when Silas tightened his grip the smallest fraction. "You forget," Silas continued, his voice as soft as it was unyielding. "Who created who? You do not get to claim me. You can serve, or you can suffer. Those are the choices you have left." He released Valian's throat, and watched the Lord stumble back, breath shuddering. "You wish to make amends? Then you will take the place I vacated. You will lie down and allow the court to admire you." Whispers rippled through the gathered fae. The idea of Lord Duskshade bearing himself on his own table was unimaginable. Valian's jaw clenched, and for a heartbeat, Silas thought he might refuse. Then, with fingers that trembled despite centuries of composure, the Fey Lord began to undo the buttons of his midnight shirt. Slowly, because Silas demanded it, Valian bared himself. Pale skin glowed in the lantern light, muscles taut beneath the surface. Silas guided him onto the velvet-draped table, arranging his limbs with care. He ran a hand down the length of Valian's throat to his sternum, feeling the frantic thrum of his heart. Then he brushed lower, to the place where invisible wings anchored to Fey flesh. Valian went rigid. No one touched a Fey Lord's wings. They were private, sacred things hidden by glamour. Silas didn't press enough to reveal them, just let his fingertips skate over the sensitive join. Valian shuddered. His glamour flickered at the edges. Only Silas saw the faint shimmer. Only he heard the half-stifled sound Valian made as sensation flooded him. "You're shaking," Silas murmured, bending so only Valian could hear. Imagine if I let them see. Imagine bearing what you have always hidden. He left the threat hanging as he straightened, turning his attention back to the watching nobles. You came for entertainment, he announced, voice carrying. Let me show you true devotion. What followed was inevitable. Silas dropped to his knees and took Valian into his mouth, one hand gripping the Fey Lord's hip, while the other stroked the base of his spine. Each motion dragged helpless sounds from Valian's throat, sounds that didn't belong to a Shadow Court lord but to a man unraveling. By the time Silas pulled off him, Valian was trembling, legs open, chest heaving. Silas guided Aurelius forward without a word. The Golden Lord settled between Valian's thighs and pushed inside slowly, but insistently enough that it drew a sharp, broken cry from the Fey Lord's lips. Valian clutched at the cushions beneath him, back arching as Aurelius seated himself fully, the stretch overwhelming and inescapably intimate. Around them, the nobles crowded closer, drawn by the sight as if by gravity. Breath hitched, silk rustled, desire thickened the air. Aurelius began to move, deep, unhurried thrusts that forced soft, wrecked sounds from Valian with every push, each one more raw than the last. Silas did not let Valian forget him. He positioned himself at the Fey Lord's mouth and offered his cock. When Valian hesitated, Silas threaded fingers through his dark hair and held him steady, pressing past lips and tongue. Each thrust was measured, not cruel, but unrelenting. Take what is given, he murmured when Valian moaned around him. You wanted power. This is what power tastes like. The scene's intensity drew others to the edges. When Silas stepped back, Lord Cassius of the Winter Court stepped forward, pale and sharp as ice. His cock was already freed from his breeches, and when he pressed it to Valian's lips, his movements held none of Silas's care. He used the Fey Lord's mouth with quick punishing strokes born of long-held resentment. Tears leaked from the corners of Valian's eyes, his hands clenched in the velvet. Between his legs, Aurelius's pace increased, each thrust pushing him further toward breaking. When the Dawn Lord reached his climax, he cried out, burying himself deep as hot seeds spilled into Valian's body. Cassius followed moments later, forcing himself down Valian's throat as he emptied between his lips. Silas watched it all with cool intent, hands stroking Valian's hair as the Fey Lord swallowed, muscles working around Cassius's cock. Only after both nobles had withdrawn did Silas reclaim his place. Aurelius's release eased his way, and as he thrust back into Valian's slick heat, he heard the Lord's breath hitch into a sob. This is what you are, he said softly, so only Valian could hear. Not a master, a vessel. You will remember this, every time you think to command me. He moved with slow, devastating care, each press designed to remind Valian of the surrender he had tried to resist. When at last he spilled inside, divine essence joining the Dawn Lord's mortal seed, Valian came undone with a cry, untouched cock, pulsing across his own abdomen. Valian. The parlor emptied in waves. Brocade skirts rustled, boots scuffed against rugs, and doors closed quietly. Voices sank into breathless whispers as the nobles retreated to private alcoves or to the night air, hands and mouths already upon one another. Their departure left Valian sprawled on the table, sweat cooling on his skin, the ache of recent use pulsing through him. Musk and incense hung heavy. The candles had guttered low. He lay there, staring up at the painted ceiling without really seeing it. His throat ached. His hips burned. Deeper still, where the base of his wings rooted beneath glamour, a phantom touch lingered. He could still feel the warm slide of Aurelius inside him, the sting of Cassius's thrusts, the gentler cruelty of Silas's hands. Every sensation was layered over the humiliation of being laid bare before his peers, of being used for their pleasure, of wanting it. He tried to move and a sharp spasm shook him. His legs trembled. A fresh flush of arousal shocked him more than any of the night's humiliations. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, where Silas had touched him as if to claim his heart. Nitharos's voice was silent now, but the echo of its approval haunted him. Perfect. The word had been like a brand. Fool, he whispered to the empty room. A bitter laugh caught in his chest. He had sought to harness a god. He had summoned a mortal he believed he could manipulate. In the end, he had given up every inch of his pride, and found something in surrender that terrified him as much as it thrilled. His wings, hidden by glamour, twitched. No one else had touched them. Not truly. But Silas's fingers had skimmed that sacred anchor, and the memory of that almost touch made his cock stir again, despite the soreness. Valion dragged himself onto his side, silk sheets clinging to his thighs, seed cooling on his skin. Shame burned hot, but it was braided with something darker and more honest, a longing to feel that hand again. To hear the god's voice purr praise when he yielded. He closed his eyes. The manor was quiet now, but the hum in the stone told him the awakening was far from over. His place in the world had shifted irrevocably. Whether he would rise or sink depended on how well he learned to navigate a landscape where he was no longer the one holding the reins. Chapter 6. Silas. The knock came just after sunset. 3 firm raps that reverberated through the studio's stone, and set Silas's pulse stuttering. He had half hoped, half feared, to hear them. For a heartbeat, he hovered over the unfinished statue. Then he set the chisel aside with care, wiped marble dust from his palms, and crossed to the heavy door that guarded his sanctuary. Behind him, the figure of Nitharos loomed, almost complete. Obsidian caught the fading light, the carved planes of a body coiled in tension. It wasn't the statue that tightened his throat, it was the pull. Since he had taken Valion before the assembled court, the need to finish this work had gnawed at him. When he tried to sleep, dreams of molten rock and low voices drove him back to the chisel. His hands throbbed when they were idle, as if the god's impatience hummed in his bones. Soon, the voice had promised, growing clearer with each passing day. Soon, my sculptor, you will give me form. Soon, Silas whispered to the empty studio. Before he could lift his tools again, the latch lifted, and cool air slipped through the opening. Mr. Blackwell? The words carried the lilting cadence of the Fae, but there was steel under the music that raised gooseflesh along his arms. A tall woman stepped into the threshold. Silver hair, the color of moonlight on metal, tumbled down her back. Her eyes were the pale blue of deep winter, and power hung around her like a cloak. He knew her name before she spoke it. Lady Lysandra, he murmured, awareness pulsing from a place deeper than memory. Recognition flickered like the first spark struck in darkness. His own, and something inside him that was not entirely his. Her mouth curved, the expression as precise as a drawn blade. So you know me, she said softly. How interesting. Her gaze flicked to the statue, and whatever composure she wore cracked for an instant. It's breathtaking, she whispered, and something like fear shadowed her features. Do you understand what you're bringing into the world? It's art, he said, though the word felt thin. It's truth. Truth rarely fits in a frame, she countered. And it doesn't enjoy chains. She moved around the effigy in a slow circle, fingertips hovering just above black glass as if she could feel heat radiating from within. Did Lord Duskshade explain why he commissioned this? What he hopes to gain? Her tone was casual, but each syllable cut cleanly through the dust-laden air. Unease coiled in his gut. He said he wanted to honor the old gods, to preserve history. Even as he spoke, the words tasted false. Lysandra laughed without humor. Honor? She echoed, amusement sharpening into scorn. Valion wants power. She met his gaze. He intends to bind what you're waking. A harsh ripple ran through the studio's shadows. Nitharos's awareness flared inside him, anger vibrating along his nerves. A binding circle, the god hissed, each word edged with heat. buried beneath the floor. Iron, salt, old glyphs. He thinks to leash me. Silas's grip tightened on his chisel until his knuckles whitened. Heat flooded his chest. He lied, he said, voice rough. Everything he's done, bringing me here, the commission, the gallery opening, it was all to cage you. Of course it was, Lysandra replied, watching him closely but perhaps not noticing that he was not speaking to her. You were useful. A mortal with skilled hands and an artist's devotion is easy to manipulate. She stepped closer, and for the first time there was a hint of warmth in her voice. But it doesn't have to end his way. Walk out. Leave Thornwick Manor. Let the stones stay silent. Don't, Netherus murmured, urgency threading through his tone. She isn't your savior. She would rather see me sleep forever than upend her own balance. Finish me. Silas's gaze flicked from the Fey woman to the statue and back. The air felt thick, charged. What do you really want? He asked her. I want the world to survive, Lysandra said plainly. I want both our realms to stand. If Velion finishes his ritual, he will doom us all. She held his eyes. You could walk away and live. You could still choose to be free. And if I don't? He kept his tone level despite the pounding in his veins. Then you will learn that mortals and gods alike are pieces on boards older than any of us, she answered, her gaze steady. And you will pay the price. A crash cut her off. The door slammed against the stone wall, and Valion burst inside. The polished lord from the court was gone. His coat hung askew. Dark hair fell across his eyes. Glamour frayed at his edges, making the air shimmer around him. Lysandra, he spat, each syllable vibrating like a plucked string. What poison do you pour in his ear? Truth, she said, her tone light, but her eyes glinting. Something you seem to have misplaced. You know nothing of my work, Valion snapped, stalking toward her. Leave, now, family or not, I won't have you meddling. Family, Netherus noted with wry amusement. Cousins snarling over scraps while power sleeps at their feet. Beneath the sardonic tone lurked fury. I know about the binding circle under these stones, Lysandra shot back. I know you've spent decades collecting the right words and blood. And I know you dangled this mortal because you lacked the courage to swing the hammer yourself. Her accusations rang inside Silas like struck bells. He saw again the gallery where Velion had found him, the hand at his back, the invitations that had felt like destiny. Each kindness was a link in a chain. You used me, he said, the knowledge settling over him like a weight. You set the stage and I played along. Velion's anger narrowed into something cold. You don't understand, he said, slipping back into the smooth cadence of persuasion. An unbound god could tear reality apart. Precautions are necessary. Lies, Netherus spat. Fear. You're afraid, Silas said aloud, meeting Velion's eyes. You're afraid that no circle, no charm, no ritual can hold him. Something like pity flared briefly. You should be. For a heartbeat, terror flickered across Velion's face before he smoothed it away. The ritual will hold, he whispered, as if saying it made it true. Silas lifted his chisel. Heat poured down his arm. The air buzzed, fine dust dancing on unseen currents. Shall we find out? Before Velion could react, Silas turned and set the blade to obsidian. Each cut rang through the studio like a clear note. Volcanic glass yielded with a sound like ice fracturing, revealing iridescent depths. With every strike, warmth built until sweat trickled down his spine. Stop, Velion lunged. Silas felt the rush of air as he moved, but an unseen force snapped Velion backward, like a puppet yanked on a string. He slammed into a workbench. Tools clattered to the floor. You don't know what you're unleashing, Velion's voice cracked, desperation shredding his cultivated composure. I know exactly what I'm finishing, Silas replied. His words vibrated through the stone. I'm keeping a promise. He raised the chisel one last time and drove it home. Fractures raced through the obsidian like lightning veins. Instead of shattering, the surface glowed. Heat pulsed from within, turning walls red and gold. The statue's chest expanded as if drawing a first breath. Its eyes softened, focusing on Silas with a look that was both familiar and vast. My sculptor. The words no longer echoed only in his mind. They came from lips as black and gleaming as polished onyx. My faithful one? You gave me shape. I will give you everything. The figure stepped down from its pedestal. Obsidian darkened to flesh. Muscles rippled as if molten rock flowed under skin. Nitharos stood before them, not fully solid. The outlines of his limbs shimmered. But the weight of his presence filled the space. Heat radiated from him. The scent of rain on hot stones saturated the air. No, Velion whispered, scrambling backward until he hit cold wall. Fear stripped away the last of his arrogance. The circle. The bindings. Nitharos laughed, a sound that was both music and thunder. Your chalked lines and whispered charms, he said, voice rich with scorn and amusement. Did you truly believe words scratched by a frightened boy could cage what has slept beneath shadow since before your kind had names? He took a single step, and the flagstones seemed to ripple under his bare feet. You wanted a pet. You birthed a storm. And now, his smile revealed sharp, bright teeth, you will learn what devotion truly costs. Chapter 7. Silas. The studio held its breath. Dust motes hung in the lamplight, their slow drift the only movement in the wake of what had just occurred. Lady Lysandra was gone, vanished the instant Nitharos slipped free of stone. Only the open door and a faint chill in the air marked her departure. Valion remained where unseen force had pinned him, back pressed against cold stone, violet eyes wide. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Every sense screamed at him to run, to get away from the god he had tried to cage, but some deeper pull kept his boots rooted. Whether the need to witness was his own, or part of the divine will no longer mattered. The pull existed, and he was powerless to deny it. Nitharos stood before his sculptor in partial form, limbs still shimmering at the edges as light and darkness slid through one another beneath skin that looked carved from night. Even unfinished, his presence made the fae seem washed out, their carefully cultivated glamour pale beside the ancient grace unfolding in the room. He was tall, his shoulders were broad, his features blended the sharpness of a man with something otherworldly that defied categorization. When he smiled, the entire space seemed to warm. But first, my faithful sculptor, he said, voice rolling over the stone with a richness that vibrated through bones rather than air. My most devoted. You gave me shape when others forgot my name. You called me back with hands guided by hunger and faith. Silas stood where his chisel had fallen, chest rising and falling as if he had been running. Stone dust clung to his skin and hair. Whatever shyness had once colored his gaze was gone. He looked at the god before him without flinching, a raw mixture of awe and desire sparking in his dark eyes. Heat pulled low in his belly at the praise. You are. He searched for words and let them fade unsaid. No single compliment seemed sufficient. His voice emerged rough with emotion. You are more than I imagined. Nitharos's smile deepened. He stepped closer, his translucent form gaining weight with each footfall. As are you, he murmured. There have been countless gifts, gold poured on my altars, blood spilled in my name, but nothing like this. You offered yourself. You listened when I called. You finished the work when others would have fled. He reached out, the back of his fingers brushing along Silas's jaw, leaving warmth in their wake. The stone demanded nothing. I whispered, but you could have turned away. You chose me. Silas shivered as long fingers teased the fastenings of his clothes, peeling away layers with care, exposing skin to the cool air 1 inch at a time. The sensation of being undressed by something both ancient and new sent a tremor through him. Perfect, Nitharos whispered against the curve of Silas's hip, his breath warm. My sculptor, my priest. Then he sank to his knees. Valian's breath snagged. There was something unsettling in watching a god kneel, not in submission, but in unashamed worship of a mortal. Nitharos took Silas into his mouth with the same patience he had shown in emerging, lips closing over him like a benediction. The wet heat of his mouth, the slow, purposeful slide of tongue and throat, made Silas's knees nearly buckle. He braced a hand against the god's shoulder. The flesh beneath it felt warm and unreal. A low, contented hum rose from Nitharos, the vibrations traveling straight through Silas and lodging deep in Valian's belly. This should have been mine, Valian thought bitterly, fingers curling into his palms hard enough to leave crescents. I planned, I worked, I bled, and here I stand, watching. The knowledge burned worse because he could see the tenderness in every movement, knew how different that worship felt to receive. He had offered Silas seduction and schemes. Nitharos offered devotion. Silas let his head fall back, eyes fluttering shut, hips rocking forward instinctively as the god drew him deeper. Each pass of Nitharos's lips sent pleasure cresting higher. He tangled his fingers in hair that shifted between the texture of silk and shadow, holding on as the world narrowed. Please, he whispered, the word pushed out on a breath that was part prayer, part warning. The god answered by taking him fully, swallowing around him with practiced ease. Heat coiled tight. Silas cried out, body tensing as release rushed through him, pleasure white-hot. Nitharos swallowed, and when he rose, his mouth was slick, his dark eyes bright with satisfaction. Mine, he breathed against Silas's lips, kissing him with slow possessiveness, sharing the taste of his own spill. The kiss was deep and unhurried. Silas leaned into it instinctively. He fit against the god's chest as if he belonged there. Valian turned his head away, throat tight. He pressed his forehead to the cool stone behind him, hiding from the sight of Silas melting into another's embrace. He had orchestrated his own undoing. He had traded what might have been real affection for the illusion of control, and now stood with neither. Laughter filled the studio, soft chuckles woven with the deeper rumble of a god amused. It didn't mock. It sounded like something shared between two people who understood each other completely. When Valian dared to look again, Nitharos had turned his attention toward him. The weight of that gaze pushed all the air from Valian's lungs. His knees gave way. He hit the floor hard, but pain seemed distant compared to the force pinning him down. Lord Duskshade, Nitharos said, amusement twining with darker currents in his tone. You planned to bind me. You thought to make a god kneel. And now look at you. Valian opened his mouth, but the usual words wouldn't come. Empty excuses lodged in his throat. What apology could he offer? That he had been desperate? That he had cared, if only belatedly? I have no defense, he forced out. I wanted power that wasn't mine. I tried to bind what shouldn't be bound. His voice cracked. I will accept whatever judgment you give. Nitharos studied him as though cataloguing each subtle change in expression. After a moment, his head tilted. You want him, he observed, voice mild. Valian's head snapped up. Shock flashed across his features. I what? The mortal, the god clarified. My sculptor, you developed feelings for him. Somewhere between your plans and your lies, something real took root. Denial rose instinctively, but it tangled with memory. The quiet moments in the studio when Valian had watched him work, the visceral jealousy that had clawed at his gut in the salon. I don't know, he whispered, honesty raw. I don't know if what I feel is mine or some ripple of your influence. But I couldn't leave him. Even knowing what awaited, I had to see this through. Nitharos's smile sharpened. It wasn't kind, but it wasn't cruel either. How refreshingly truthful, he murmured, and perfectly suited for what comes next. Chapter 8. Valian. Nitharos bared his teeth in a smile that caught the dim light of the studio. He paced around Valion with the slow confidence of someone considering an intricate piece of work. Justice, he mused, voice low and unhurried. It ought to fit the crime, don't you think? You wanted me shackled, silent, obedient, and adornment to your ambitions. Valion's throat tightened. The urge to flinch burned through him, but he forced himself to meet those dark eyes. Death would be kind compared to what he sensed coming. At least it would be over. I think, Netharos continued, leaning in so his words brushed Velion's skin, that you should feel exactly what you intended for me. Not death, not pain. Something far more complete. You will know what it is to have your will stripped away until you exist only to please. A chill raced down Valion's spine. He had envisioned the god groveling at his feet, chained by runes and ritual. Now the image returned twisted back upon him. To become nothing but a vessel for someone else's desire, to feel your own thoughts disappear. He wanted to vomit at the thought. But not to me, Netharos added, amusement flickering at the corners of his mouth. Confusion must have shown, because the god laughed softly. No, Valion. That would be too simple. You should serve the one you truly wronged. Silas's head jerked. Netharos, wait. He will be yours, the god cut in, still circling Valion. His voice took on the resonance of command. Completely. Every thought, every desire, every breath subject to your will. He who sought to use you will become your most devoted instrument. The words hit Valion with the force of a blow. To be bound to Silas, made to please him on command, while knowing every emotion he felt would be manufactured by the binding. It was exquisite cruelty. Heat flooded his face. His hands shook where they pressed against the floor. He will pleasure you when you ask it, Netharos intoned. He will anticipate your needs. He will adore you without the ability to question why. A fitting reversal for someone who traded in deception. Valion's fingers curled into fists until his knuckles creaked. It was what he deserved, and yet the idea of being turned into a toy for Silas's amusement twisted his stomach. The court would learn of it. He would become a story whispered with vicious glee. Lord Duskshade, lowered to a mortal's plaything. Wait! Silas's voice cut through the pronouncement with unexpected strength. The god's head tilted. If I may, Silas continued, stepping between them. I have another idea. Netharos arched a brow. You would ask for mercy? His tone held genuine curiosity. Not mercy, Silas replied. His gaze flicked to Valion and held. Understanding. He came back. He could have run, but he didn't. That means something. Netharos considered him in silence. What do you propose, my sculptor? Give him to me, Silas said, words deliberate. Valion's breath hitched. But not as an automaton. Let him choose. Every day. Let him stay because he wants to earn back what he threw away. The binding he planned would have stolen my choice. I won't steal his. The god's mouth curved thoughtfully. How very human of you, he murmured. You would trust him to redeem himself. I would trust him to try, Silas corrected softly. He will either prove himself worthy or he won't. But he should do it honestly. For a moment, the room was very still. Valion's heart pounded loudly in his ears. The hope blooming in his chest felt almost too fragile to touch. At last, Netharos nodded. So be it. Lord Valion Duskshade, you will not be chained to pleasure on command. Instead, you are bound to the truth. You may not lie to Silas Blackwell by word or deed. You may not coerce or manipulate him. If you choose to serve him, it must be with complete honesty about your motives and your heart. Should he accept, what grows between you will be your own. Something loosened inside Valion. Air flowed more easily into his lungs. A tremor that wasn't entirely fear ran through him. Do you accept these terms? Netharos's gaze held him fast. Valion looked at Silas. Those dark eyes that had haunted him since the gallery were steady on his face. Unreadable, but absent of malice. He swallowed hard. I accept, he said. the words a whisper, but true. Then stand, Silas told him. If you choose to kneel, let it be because you wish to, not because you are forced. Valian's legs felt like lead. He pushed himself upright anyway. Meeting Silas's eyes stole the breath from his chest. There was no triumph there. Only a tentative invitation. Now, Nitharos said, settling into a chair that appeared behind him as if drawn from air, we should discuss more pleasant matters. I find myself curious about your world, my sculptor. I have been stoned for too long. Perhaps it is time to see what awaits beyond this manor. Silas looked between the god and Valian. Despite the weight of what had just been decided, the corners of his mouth lifted. Then I suppose, he said, we should call for some tea. Valian let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Laughter bubbled up, ragged and surprising. Uncertainty stretched before him like the night sky. Dark, vast, filled with endless possibilities. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't afraid of what he couldn't see. Epilogue. 6 months later. Silas. The workshop held the familiar grit of marble dust and the sweet bite of incense. Nitharos insisted on lighting coils of resin that scented the air with something rich and resinous. He claimed it helped him think. Silas had learned not to argue with a god about incense, especially when the haze seemed to coax life from stone. You're distracted, Nitharos said lazily. He lay stretched out beneath the skylight, sunlight catching the planes of his face. Over the months his form had settled, no longer shimmering at the edges. He was solid and warm. Even in the mortal clothes Valian procured, expensive shirts, soft trousers, he still looked like something not meant to be contained by fabric. Silas paused, chisel hovering above a block of Carrara. It's the commission from Saint Erasmus. They want an angel that inspires without seducing. I'm not sure how to carve something holy that doesn't also look like it. Might ask you to sin. Nitharos laughed, a sound that rolled through the workshop. My poor sculptor, still trying to separate the sacred from the profane? Some of us still have to keep clients happy, Silas shot back, though the warmth in his tone softened the words. In truth, money had stopped being an issue. Between Nitharos's casual creation of gems and Valian's uncanny skill with investments, Silas could be as selective as he wanted with commissions. Footsteps sounded on the staircase. Valian appeared in the doorway carrying parcels, a gust of cool air following him. Hair that he usually kept immaculate stuck up at an end, and there was a flush high on his cheeks from the walk back. He set the packages on the work table with care. The gallery wonders if you'd consider a show next spring, he reported, voice deferential without being meek. I told them you'd need to think about it. The simple courtesy, being asked instead of told, sent warmth through Silas's chest. The change in Valian had been gradual. The razor-sharp manipulator now seemed almost earnest in his desire to be useful. He noticed when Silas's tools were growing dull, anticipated when he would run out of plaster, and asked before making plans. What kind of show? Silas asked, genuinely curious. Mixed medium, Valian said, pulling at the string around a parcel. They want to pair your work with live models. They're hoping, he added, and there was no way to miss the honesty there, that Nitharos might agree to pose. The publicity would make you very popular. Nitharos rolled onto his elbow, interest gleaming. How decadent. Mortals lining up to gaze at me? Delicious. We'll discuss it, Silas said, even as he pictured the chaos of setting a guard among patrons. Valian began to unpack supplies. A new mallet he had mentioned needing, blocks of fine sandpaper, jars of his favorite pigments, and small luxuries. Candied ginger, beeswax for his hands, that proved how closely the Fey Lord observed him. There's more, Valian said, producing a letter with a familiar seal. Your sister writes. She asks when she can visit again. Silas smiled. Clara's last visit had been an enthusiastic survey of his strange household. She had taken to Nitharos's grand statements with amusement, and interrogated Velian about the politics of the Shadow Court. "Tell her whenever she likes," he said. "But warn her, she's bringing her thesis advisor next time. Something about post-classical influences in contemporary sculpture." Nitharos groaned theatrically. "Mortals and their categories," he complained. "But very well. If it advances human knowledge, I shall endure being stared at." "Such sacrifice," Velian murmured, earning a rare laugh from the god. Silas watched them banter and felt contentment settle over him. He stepped back from the marble he'd been carving and uncovered his current work. Within the block, a figure was emerging, his own likeness, yet transformed. The eyes held a light that had never existed in his mortal reflection. The hands were caught mid-gesture as if shaping the air itself. "Show me," Nitharos said, his tone shifting to something more serious. Silas stepped aside. Nitharos rose and circled the sculpture with unexpected reverence. "You're carving yourself as I see you," he murmured. "As you made me," Silas answered softly. "As you chose to be," Nitharos corrected, reaching out to hover his fingers above the carved cheek. "My priest, my equal. Mortal flesh and divine purpose sharing space." Silas set his tools aside and moved to the window. Outside, the city hummed with life. Traders haggled, children laughed, cartwheels clattered. None of them knew a god of desire leaned against his windowsill, or that a Faelord stacked boxes in a sculptor's studio. "What comes next?" he asked, unsure if he addressed Nitharos, Velion, or himself. Nitharos joined him, shoulder-bumping Silas's. "Whatever we choose," he said simply. "We have time." Valian stood on Silas's other side, a comfortable distance away but close enough to be counted. "Whatever serves your vision," he said, voice quiet. "Whatever brings you joy." Silas looked at him and felt a warmth unfurl. "You've been good," he said, the words making Velian glance down with a flush that crept up his throat. "I think you've earned something." Valian. For months, he had woken each morning and chosen to stay, to help, to love. There had been no enchantment driving him, just his own stubborn desire to prove himself worthy. He had hoped, but not dared to ask, that Silas might want him this way again. Now desire flared, hot and immediate. He inhaled, the scent of incense and stone filling his lungs, and let himself imagine. Silas stretched beneath him, lips swollen, eyes heavy. Hands that usually held a chisel digging into his shoulders. He had pictured it too many times to count during long nights spent alone. "What did you have in mind?" he managed, voice thick. Silas's answering smile held mischief and something tender. "Come upstairs," Silas said, and then added, eyes flicking to Nitharos. "Both of you." Nitharos's grin was wicked. "I do enjoy watching you two discover each other," he purred as he pushed to his feet. Silas. He had intended the moment to be gentle. A thank you. A reminder that the past did not define the present. But the instant they were through the door of the bedroom, Valian's hands were on him, pulling him close. Lips that had once sneered were now fervent, murmuring his name between gasps as if it were a prayer. Silas laughed breathlessly, and pulled away enough to catch his balance. Heat rushed up his neck. "Slow," he whispered, stroking Valian's flushed cheek. "I want to savor this." A weight pressed against Valian's back. Nitharos's arms slid around his chest, drawing him against a body that radiated warmth. "Patience, pretty one," the god murmured, teeth scraping lightly along the point of Valian's ear. "You spent centuries taking. Let us show you what it is to be wanted." Silas straddled Valian where he sat on the edge of the bed. His hands shook, but his touch was sure. "Tell me if it's too much," he said quietly, searching Valian's face. "I need to know this is what you want." Valian's pupils were blown wide. He nodded. "Please," he rasped. "Whatever you give. I want it." Silas leaned in, kissing him deeply. The kiss was slow and thorough, tasting of shared wine and anticipation. When he pulled back, his own lips were reddened. "Then wait for me," he murmured. He pressed Velion back onto the coverlet with gentle hands. Netheros's grip kept him steady, but never harsh, holding him as if to remind him that restraint could be care, not just control. Silas took his time. He kissed along Velion's throat, across his collarbones, down the plane of his abdomen. Each touch was a question. "Do you still want this?" Each answered by the hitch of breath, the way Velion's fingers dug into the sheets. When Silas finally eased down onto him, the slide was slow and careful. Heat bloomed at the point of connection. Velion arched, a sound torn from him. Netheros pressed a palm flat over his chest, grounding him. "He said wait," the god reminded softly, the command layered with affection. Silas rolled his hips in shallow circles that sent electricity sparking through both of them. He moaned, the noise small and surprised, and bent to kiss Velion again. His mouth, his jaw, the pulse fluttering in his throat. "I've wanted you like this," he whispered, words punctuated by soft gasps. "Because I choose you." "You have me," Velion choked out, honesty flooding every syllable. "All of me." Silas cupped his jaw and swallowed the next moan. The rhythm built, each movement drawing them closer. He felt the coil tighten low in his belly. "Stay with me," he begged, voice cracking. "Wait, I want us to fall together." "I'm trying," Velion gasped, heels digging into the mattress. Sweat glistened along his brow. "Silas, please." "Now," Silas breathed against his mouth. He let go, and release took both of them at once. Bodies tensing, cries muffled by mouths, pleasure cresting and breaking like a wave against shore. Heat flooded between them, and the world narrowed to the space they shared. When the spasms eased, Silas collapsed forward, cheek against Velion's chest. His limbs felt boneless. Netheros loosened his grip, pressing a kiss further